Hi class. This is a short lecture on language documentation dissemination. We've already covered some of the aspects of the process of disseminating the products of language documentation. So when we're thinking about those products of documentation, those are likely to be the audio sources, video sources, textual sources that have documented aspects of a language. And so why do we disseminate this information? Well, we've gone through the trouble of pressing record, capturing information about a language, hopefully doing some annotation of it. We've maybe then gone through the next step of storing it in something like an archive. And now we have to think about what's next. And there are a number of options that for use of that material. Some can be for research, so doing things like linguistic research on the structure of the language, the syntax, comparing a particular language to other languages to trace things like comparative linguistics, which might look at how languages have evolved and where languages have derived from. So looking back at common linguistic ancestors for how a language has spread. And there can be some really interesting things that come from that. You've got languages like the Athabascan language family, and that's mostly thought of as a language that's found up in Alaska and the Canadian, northern Canada. But we also see the language in the American Southwest. The Navajo language is a Athabascan language. And so we then have to think, well, how did this language get there? Well, those people migrated, and their language is one of the ways that we can tell who they are and where they were, because their language is able to be shown as similar enough to other Athabascan languages in a root language area. So that type of research can certainly tell us a number of things, both from linguistic and from anthropological or cultural perspectives. We are going to be interested in dissemination for publications, both for academic and non-academic audiences. Education. Certainly a main thrust for why documentation is conducted is in hopes that it will be used for educational purposes. And those educational purposes can be a variety of different outlets, and may also be part of revitalization if a language is seen as being endangered. So how does that dissemination occur? This could be via language education technology, such as software, websites, and computer programs, through curriculum, which may be found in books, handouts, websites, learning management systems, various curriculum that can be developed for direct educational use. Archives. Archives can directly facilitate dissemination of language material, though in the majority of cases they are not doing this for educationally relevant purposes. So archives are certainly a place that the products of documentation can be accessed, but those products of documentation are rarely going to be in a form that makes them usable, that makes them highly usable by a language community who is interested in either learning about the language or using that product of documentation for education. Academic publications. And interactive technologies. These could be things like augmented reality or locative technologies that utilize your smartphone or some product like Google Glass, so that where you are and in your field of vision, you are alerted to pieces of information that are relevant to a language. And so one example from a community I worked with in Alaska, the Gwich'in community, they have an archive, and they've put on a augmented reality layer on the building. So when you point your smartphone or a product like Google Glass at the building, you can be alerted that there is embedded digital material via a web service. And so through your smartphone, you can be pointing the camera, you can be alerted that there's material, you can access it, and maybe that's a welcome message in the language, or you're using something like a QR code, those codes you see on the back of products, and those can be placed in physical locations that you scan with your phone, and all of a sudden, boom, you get some interesting information about that particular site. Maybe it's a place name. Maybe it's a piece of oral tradition describing that place and where you are. So those are types of interactive technologies that can be employed. And what are some dissemination considerations? Certainly intellectual property. Who owns that material, and have they provided consent for that material to be shared, and in what capacity? The internet has really provided a whole new layer of complexity in how we consider intellectual property, because it's certainly one thing to give someone permission to use a piece of information or a recording for their own localized purposes. But it's a whole nother set of permissions and considerations if that piece is going to then be available as a digital file on the internet. And so how material travels around in digital forms and its ability to be replicated and shared in such a quick manner through the internet provides a whole nother layer of intellectual property concerns. Intellectual property is also thought of in terms of things like how is that knowledge used for monetization. And so if someone is trying to do ethnobotanical research on knowledge that Amazonian tribes have about plants that may have medical properties. Okay, you might be making recordings, you might be doing language documentation, but what is going to be done with that information? Is there going to be a profit generated from it, and is there some mechanism for consent and compensation for those people who have that intellectual property? Sensitive information can be things like that, knowledge that people have that they don't want commodified and monetized. It could also be things like religious information, information about secret societies or spiritual practices. Many times in Native American communities, there are long-standing processes of ownership of knowledge, whether that takes the place of a song or a story or a place name or a actual person's name, and those ownership processes may be quite ingrained in the community and quite sensitive, and sharing those without proper permissions and knowledge of how that material should be shared could go against the grain of the wishes of the community. There are potentially legal and political implications as well. We've talked in other situations how language and politics are connected to things like sovereignty, demonstration of alterity or difference that may be required to access to rights, resources, and territory. And so that information held within an archival recording could describe the nature of attachment that a community has to a resource gathering site, or it could describe a long-standing connection to a location that is in consideration for creating a mine. And so those are direct legal and political implications with who has access to that recording and that information, and who can interpret it and recontextualize it to make that oral tradition or that form of knowledge understandable in a modern context. And the last consideration I have is the utility of the products of documentation for education and revitalization. There's certainly a difference between having a linguistic treatment. This is an article on, we're looking at alternating roots in Lummi. And so this is a very detailed linguistic treatment of how root words are utilized and will alternate in various forms. It's very important information for dissecting how a language operates and how its syntax is put together, but quite difficult to make into a teaching tool. No language learner is going to look at this page and learn the language easier if they are a young person or someone who is new to the language. Maybe someone who is obtaining a very high level of fluency and interested in really understanding at a fine level would be able to utilize this material, but that's going to be a pretty select group of people. And so, yes, the grammatical structure is important for how language is taught, but my point is that the actual product of documentation here, this academic publication, does not translate readily into something usable by a community interested in education. So just briefly, here are a few other examples of dissemination tools. This is a archive. It's one of the larger ones in the world. This is called ELAR. And within ELAR, you can search through a variety of languages and pieces of documentation. So we can look at a map view if we wanted, and we could find a language in the world. Let's see. Let's go over here. Mongolia. And we'll be able to find the products of documentation that exist for this language in this archive. And every archive is different in how they have arranged material and how they describe it here in the metadata. And so as we go through, we can determine both the different languages that are part of Western Mongolia. We can see different genres for information, and we are also going to see things like our access. Not all materials are going to be accessible in an archive, and some may be so this has a number of different tags on it, so wedding wishes, benediction, and it's going to be a recording, but we don't actually have access to it. And so we've found it, it's part of this archive, but we don't have access at our user level. And so we would have to log in first and create our account, and then maybe we would have the proper access to it. So that's just one way that archives are used is they are going to be preserving this material, they're going to be making it accessible to people, but this isn't necessarily an intuitive process for someone who's wanting to learn a language. Maybe this is a first step in creating a piece of curriculum, is accessing this recording, but it may or may not have utility in that way, and it really takes another second step of someone who's able to then translate this material into a good product for education. So a couple other examples. Rosetta Stone. Rosetta Stone's a pretty famous example of a language teaching tool. They've got lots of different languages available, and they have worked with some endangered languages to create, to utilize the software for teaching those languages. It is yet to be seen how successful that has been, but the platform itself is quite widely used. And so a project like this, whether it's Rosetta Stone or it's something that is related and modeled after, is one way to take those products of documentation and start making them into something that's usable for educational purposes. Another example, this one a little more directed to endangered languages, is called First Voices. First Voices is a product of First Peoples Council in Vancouver Island, near Vancouver, BC. And there are a number of languages who have participated in this. Just started playing as soon as I went to the site. Didn't quite realize that was going to happen. But so this First Voices site allows a community to both host and store their language materials, and then make those available for educational use. So there are things like games that you can play with words that they've uploaded and phrases. You can go to this page that shows Learn Our Language. You can start hearing the language on many of the pages. It just starts playing. We can list words alphabetically, and here we can click on see an English gloss and then the word in Sanchasan. We can then click on it, and we would be able to hear it play and see an image that corresponds. So this is, again, a little bit more of an intuitive educational mechanism, but it takes a lot of back-end work, and we'll talk about First Voices a little bit more when we talk about language revitalization programs, but this is one way to take those products of documentation and make them available for educational use. Last example is something like a reference grammar. Reference grammars can be invaluable tools for people who are working on a language. Again, they are really much more designed for linguists who are studying how a language is put together and works, and they are going to be useful for educational projects, but as themselves and as a reading material, people aren't going to read through them and learn a language necessarily. They're without pre-existing training and ability to make it through the material. So those are all some examples of why language documentation dissemination occurs, how it's used, and what are some considerations when we're thinking about making those materials available, especially in the context of the internet. Thank you.